because I didn't know if I was going to have people who were thinking about homeschooling, people who've been homeschooling for 10 years. So this is probably going to bore some of you to tears. So I thought you could just tell me what you'd like to talk about and we can do the whole thing. I usually start out with general reasons for homeschooling, which over the years have kind of switched around. You know, a couple decades ago, it used to be really religious beliefs used to be really high on the docket. Now it's almost all worries about the school environment, not even so much as academics. And certainly this epidemic of school shootings seems to be getting a lot of people thinking about homeschool. It looks like it's about 3.5% of school kids are homeschooled. So it keeps creeping up, which is nice to see.
Yeah, I feel like I can relate to the top 5 reasons.
Yeah, well, you know, I do a lot of school book talks and school workshops for kids. And now, whenever you go to do something at the public school, they show you where the safe room is. And it's really just very disturbing.
Safe room? I'm glad I haven't even heard that. That sounds scary.
Well, statistically, you know, you're certainly not about to die if you walk into a public school.
Oh, I see what you mean. I didn't.
But it's it's been very heavily in the news, and of course all the kids
Oh, it's terrifying, the shootings, yeah.
are being trained as to what to do. And there are a number of certainly middle school books out now that deal with this kind of topic. Another reason to homeschool, this is a recent article from the New Scientist. I think it came out just a couple of weeks ago. Somebody did studies with herd animals, and they found out that animals that are a little outside of the herd, that aren't raised right with the main group, turn out to be problem-solving animals. Very independent, resourceful, self-actualized animals. And they did this with like 13 or 14 different types of herd animals, you know, everything from giraffes to bighorn sheep. I think they did horses, but they found out that the slightly off-the-wall animals turned out to be very, very effective in terms of supporting themselves. And the belief was that this is because you haven't been always part of a conforming group. You don't have a whole lot to depend on other than yourself. So these animals just turned out to be really smart animals. I don't know if this applies to people, but it sounded good, didn't it?
Well, yeah. And I can certainly see how that plays out in the kids that I've seen that are homeschooled.
Well, my whole background really is science. So I kind of tend toward this. And the going thing in science is that we've cured everything in mice. So there's just so much you can do with animals. Oh, I was going to say mean things about the public school. That's probably not fair because I know a ton of wonderful, dedicated teachers. But have any of you seen a book called Substitute? It's by Nicholson Baker, that thing. And Baker, he's an essayist and a writer. He's from Maine, and he spent a year as a substitute teacher in Maine. And he substituted for every single class from kindergarten through 12th grade, and wrote this absolutely fascinating book about his experience as a substitute. And it was very telling in the difficulties that the public school has in educating kids. I really recommend this book.
Substitute is called?
It's just called Substitute. And it's a fun, interesting read.
It's actually when I decided to homeschool. was before I had kids and I was substitute teaching.
And that did it?
Oh yeah, I was like, no, nope. I worked at a Montessori preschool and then I subbed and was like, oh, this is really, really different.
Well, you know what's interesting? It's so bizarre to think that we segregate kids by age, and then the schools are becoming more and more restrictive. It's very limited what teachers can say, what teachers can do, what books are available, which of course drives me raving insane. But when I've gone around to public schools, there used to be a public school on Isle Mont. They closed it. But it was a tiny little school. I don't think it had more than 35 kids, K through 6. And it worked basically like kind of biggish homeschooling, because they only had 2 kindergartners. So, you know, the classes were grouped. It wasn't all the 6-year-olds, all the 7-year-olds. They did a lot of kind of one-room schooling sort of things. And, you know, when I got there, the entire school was in their little cafeteria area playing various kinds of board games. And they had a walking trail out back. I thought, I would have sent my kids to that school. But you don't find a lot of those anymore. This is just an overview of various approaches people take to homeschooling. So unschooling, or child-led learning, is probably the least structured of the bunch. This is basically where you find what your kid is interested in and try to help them pursue it. You're a facilitator. Its opposite number is school at home, which is extremely structured homeschooling. Usually parents follow a curriculum which is very close to what the public school does. So basically it's like setting up school in your back room. Then there are unit studies, which are cool. These are usually multidisciplinary studies centering around a given topic. You're going to study birds. So you read fiction books and nonfiction books, you build little bird nests, you build bird houses, you go on bird walks. You just approach birds from every angle that you can think of. You read a biography of Audubon. You make bird drawings. You keep a bird journal. We were very into birds at one point. Then there's classical homeschooling, which Susan Wise Bauer has a book on it called The Well-Trained Mind, which is full of lists, which I have to say really appeals to me. I love lists of everything you should know about ancient Egypt. Classical homeschooling is based on the trivium, which in a medieval university would have been grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. So the classical idea is that grammar, which is a lot of memorizing, a lot of information, is for ages 6 through 10. Then dialectic, which is debate, discussion, asking questions, and approaching things through logical argument, is for ages 10 through 12. And then rhetoric, 13 and up, is taking all the information that you've processed in your younger years and putting them together in various kinds of outputs. You know, reports, science experiments. And then there's Charlotte Mason, which a lot of people love. Charlotte Mason was a British educator in the late 1800s, and her technique is very heavy on reading, literature, and narrating. So there's a lot of your kid reads something and then you get them to tell you back what they just read. What took place during the pandemic, when everybody had to go home from school and be on their computer all the time, was called homeschooling, which really bugged me because this was not homeschooling. This was school at home, and it was probably the worst possible permutation of school at home. But in terms of this, I mean, a lot of people just mix and match. I know we did lots of little bits of all kinds of things all over the place. And certainly when we were just starting to homeschool, and I'm old, I mean, there was diddly squat when we first started homeschooling. There was very little out there.
Can I ask what state you were in Vermont?
When we started, my husband is a biotech. I mean, we met in a lab, we got married. Started having these children, so I stayed home with the kids. But in the early days of biotech, we moved all over the place. So we had a lot of experience in various states' attitudes toward homeschooling. Yes, we did homeschool in Vermont.
It wasn't legal?
Yes, it was, but I was not, and I would not recommend anybody do
Oh, I see.
what I did. You know, I was sort of counting on, all right, I've got a PhD in biochem, and if you try to come after me, we will have an exciting lawsuit. I just, don't do it. When our oldest, we've got 3 boys, when our oldest turned 6, we were in California. In California at the time, you had limited options for being able to homeschool. One was you could declare your home a private school, which I thought sounded good, but then it turns out you have to have a separate refrigerator for milk. You have to have a separate bathrooms for different genders.
What?
No, California at the time was terrible about this. Or you could be under the guidance of an accredited teacher, in which case you had to follow along with what the public school was doing. Or you yourself could be an accredited teacher. And I thought, well, I'll try that. Surely I've got something that overlaps with this. I had nothing. Biostatistics, I think, was the closest I had to an education credit. So it would have taken me, nearly 4 years to get accredited as a teacher. So we didn't do anything. So this started our long series of criminal events. We went to Missouri, which is a marvelous state to homeschool in. At the time in Missouri, the only thing you had to do was keep attendance records. And it's like piece of cake. We were legal in Missouri,
Yeah.
I'm here, the kids are here, yep.
Check.
Pennsylvania is a tough state. Vermont is one of the worst states. I've even got a slide about this somewhere. Worst states for homeschooling. Massachusetts and Pennsylvania are tough for homeschooling because they don't have a central state agency that rules on homeschooling regulations. It's left up to individual school districts. So you can have a school district that's like, sure, we support you, we're all for it, how can we help you? And then you can have one that, not in my district, we're not having you step outside of the public school pathway. So it's by guess and by golly for those 2 states. New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont are all very highly regulated. And so I'm sure some of you have gone through the register in Vermont. I did not. When we moved back to Vermont, I'm originally from Swanton, so we came back to Vermont. We were living in southern Vermont. Our oldest then was 13. And we started doing a public access TV show called Homeschool Talk, which was a great project for the kids because all 3 of the kids worked on it. We learned how to use the cameras, the soundboard, how to set up a whole television show. We did it for 4 years or so. We got syndicated to Burlington, and we were illegal the whole time. So finally, in the course of one of these shows, I invited we had one home study consultant at the time, and in Montpelier, and invited her to come down, and we would show people on air how to work through all the paperwork to register your kid for homeschool in Vermont. And she said, well, you're not legal. I think at the time our youngest by then was 15. So we registered him on this TV show. And I was really bothered by them. First, we sent in all the paperwork. Then they wanted to know what textbooks we were going to use. And we weren't a big textbook using homeschool group. I'll show you, there are a few textbooks that I found that I really like. But by and large, I think a textbook works better as a reference book than it does as a textbook. So they wanted to see the table of contents of all of Caleb's textbooks. And we sort of muddled through until Caleb turned 16, and then it was over. So I would not recommend that anybody do what we did. I mean, we were just ornery. You can work through the Vermont regulations and do a very creative homeschooling program of your own, while still at least nominally towing the line. Okay, I talked to my kids about this.
I have a question. Does anyone know, does it get harder? Because it doesn't seem to me to be that big of a deal at the moment. I mean, we've only had, our oldest is 7, turning 8, so we've only had to register him. But I mean, it's just sort of like, as long as they're getting better, that's what I can get out of it. It doesn't seem to be like super.
Right now, that's been my experience too. My
Yeah.
oldest is 13, and
Yeah.
we have a really supportive teacher who does our evals at the
Oh,
end of the year.
gotcha.
Yeah.
She's great because she's just can think outside of the box.
Good, yeah.
She's great, and then I know others in the room do their own portfolios, but still don't, they're not doing school at home, and they're very creative.
Right.
And are able to present their children's growth in a way that the state
That the
is.
state's okay with,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and as long as you can do that, you're good.
Right.
But it sort of depends on your situation too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I asked my kids, my grown-up kids, what they thought looking back on their homeschool educations. And they said that observing their mother, that the main thing that they thought we should talk about is do not panic. And we all do. I mean, you turn around and you look at your child, and we've been doing X, Y, and Z all week, and you think, they're never going to get into college. They're going to be in the gutter as adults. This is going to be all my fault. And that is when you turn around and you say, all right, we're going to do nothing but sex and math for 3 weeks. Forget the creativity, forget the child-led learning. No, I'm scared. And they said, don't do that. We did fine. Everything was fine. But it's very difficult from, where you're sitting with all these little kids, because if you could just peek ahead 10 years and you could see that they were all fine, they'll be all fine. But yeah, don't panic. They even made me a mug at one point.
That's great.
Oh, and when to give up. I think one of the best things about homeschooling is that it's easily observable when they're not learning a thing. If they're not happy, they're unhappy with what they're doing, they're jabbing their brother with a pencil, they're kicking the chair. They want something to eat, they want something to drink, they would like to go outside and play. They're not enjoying what they're doing, so they're not gonna be learning. And it's really very clear when this happens. And, I mean, I loved to plan homeschool activities, unit studies. I mean, list making is me. And sometimes, you know, you've got this wonderful list. I remember coming up with a lovely program. We were going to learn all about taxonomy. So we were going to start out reading about Linnaeus. We had all these little animal cards that we were going to put in groups, and plant cards we were going to put in groups. We were going to learn Latin names. They weren't having any of it. They were bored to tears with taxonomy. They didn't even like the word taxonomy. And, you know, eventually I realized, well, we're not gonna do this. We'll get back to it later sometime. We'll approach it some other way. Sometimes you just have to drop it. Anybody else think this? Sometimes you have to drop it, right?
I feel like I have to drop everything.
That's actually a wonderful comment, because I started writing professionally when our kids were babies. When I had more time, perversely, to write than I did when they were older and we were homeschooling. I would have deadlines periodically where, you know, you're on your own. But I would take notes on what they did when they were on their own. And they were amazing on their own. You know, they would build things. They would play chess. They would build a treehouse. They would read. They were very, as homeschooled kids, they were very self-sufficient. And all of them always said that they were never, ever bored. Except over taxonomy and some of the things that their mother tried to dump on them. Journaling. You guys keep journals? I really recommend a journal.
I do a lot of I should probably do some journaling.
Put it on your list.
Yeah.
I tell people, just keep a list. Just keep a quick list of, you know, what you did today. And write down what books they read.
Yeah, I've been saying that since kindergarten.
I know. This is one of mine. I've got volumes and volumes of these things. Which now I do all of this on a computer if I do it, but in the olden days you wrote it down in a little notebook. But one reason to keep a journal is because periodically you get discouraged. It doesn't look like anything's working. The kids are all fighting. It's a bad day. This is my Bible. You know, you've made a terrible mistake. They're turning out horrible human beings. But if you've got a journal, you can flip back through it and see the immense numbers of things that you've actually done. You've done tons of projects and field trips. You've read a million books. So if you keep some kind of journal, it's a real self-confidence builder. I'm just totally into that. The worst states. Oh, Falling for Science. I'm not even sure this is one of Sherry Turkle's older books, but it's a hoot. She went and she interviewed all these college students who are now at MIT, and were all engineering tech majors of one kind or another, and said, how did you get interested in science? Did it start when you were a kid? And they all came up with these wonderful stories about how they just fooling around with something or other started them for the rest of their lives being fascinated with science. And one of the best stories was about this little girl who had a basket of those plastic Easter eggs. And she'd strung a string across her bedroom. I think she had bunk beds. So it went from the top bunk bed to a window, and she put the basket on it and spun it around, and the eggs didn't fall out of it. And she was thrilled to death. And she experimented, how fast could you go? How slow could you go? Ran downstairs to tell her parents, and her dad said, well, that's centrifugal force. And basically everybody knows about this, and you'll be studying it eventually in school. And she said, it didn't matter. She said, I discovered it all by myself, and I will never forget the thrill of that. But, what are my notes on this? There were all kinds of things that they talked about. Of course, a lot of people had Legos. One math major got into higher math from coming up with different ways to braid My Little Pony's fluffy tail. I mean, you have to love this stuff. Sandcastles, prisms. So all of them had something that they remembered fooling around with as a kid that really got them inspired to go into science. And one of the books that I keep giving to people is Russell Hoban of the Francis Twins. It's a little badger. Well, how Tom beat Captain Nadjork in his Hired Sportsman is all about Tom, who never seems to be doing anything academically legitimate. He fools around with mud and sticks and piles of things. And he turns out to have invented all this stuff that allows him to defeat Captain Norjack. So it's a fun book on the advantages of just independent play. Kind of leave them alone and let them play. Which is another thing that I see as a real problem with the public schools now, is that there's just very little opportunity for independent investigation. And even research is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. But I was watching one little girl who was in one of my writing workshops from the public school. She had organized a group at recess where they had invented a magical kingdom out under the trees at the edge of the playground. She'd kind of invented Dungeons and Dragons. So they were doing a role-playing game, and they all had names. They all had different little territories on the playground, and this was just from being left alone. All right, science leads me to danger. I forget when Lenore Skenazy wrote Free Range Kids, but she was in the New York Times because she had put her 9-year-old on the subway and sent him across New York City by himself. And she was being advertised as the worst mother in the world. So she wrote a book that said, no, it's really important for kids to have the kind of independence so that they can function this way by themselves without panicking. And I really admired her at the time because personally, going by subway by myself across New York City is something that intimidates me. My oldest son went to grad school in New York. And the first time I went down to visit him, I was just glued to his side. Don't leave me here. I will never return. But the benefits of giving kids independent space to explore on their own seems to be something that there's less and less of, but it's turning out to be more and more important. And especially in terms of nature, like Last Child in the Woods. I think we're really lucky in Vermont because our kids aren't going to be the last children in the woods. They've all had the opportunity to go climb a tree. But the lists of things that are found in Last Child in the Woods that many kids don't have a chance to do or possibly aren't allowed to do anymore. You know, do you get to dam up a stream? Do you get to climb a tree? Do you get to catch tadpoles? All the messy stuff that certainly most of us did as kids is getting rarer. This is where the danger comes in. As a biochemist, I can tell you that I did terrible, terrible things with my chemistry set. That my mother did not know about. And my children doubtless have done terrible things that I didn't know about because they were always very imaginative and really wanted to be into explosives. I can distinctly remember one of them coming down and saying, I know how to make nitroglycerin. I'm going, no. You know, there are points where we draw lines. Yes, I'm glad you're interested in chemistry, but not to that extent. Science is often appealing because there's a little hint of danger to it, especially chemistry. You know, kids really do want to make something go bang or make purple smoke. There's a lot of ways that you can do this without endangering your kids, but with keeping the idea that there's some possibilities still there. I mean, we want them, we don't want them to fall off the cliff, but we want them to kind of look at the cliff. I'm not putting this very well, but you know what I mean. Mad Science is a wonderful book. This is what every kid wants to do in chemistry, and you're not going to get a chance to because your mother's not going to let you. But he's got all these, this is by Theodore Gray, who I first ran into when I was doing a paper on the periodic table, I think, for somebody or other. And he built a periodic table. He built a table, and it's got all these little pockets in it that contain the proper element, or as much as you possibly could. You know, you can't have a box of hydrogen, but he's got a wonderful website now that's on the periodic table. Click on an element, find out all kinds of cool things. Mad Science is his showing you science experiments that are just fabulous, but you really shouldn't do them at home. You know, like throwing a batch of sodium into a bathtub full of water and watching it go boom. It's fascinating, and the kids love it. So, you know, I would bring this excitement into science any day of the week. You don't have to do it in your bathtub, but show them what could happen. It's the same with backyard ballistics. Gerstel has written a whole bunch of books on various kinds of things that you can build that shoot long distances or high up in the air. And I know rockets were really a hot thing around our house for years. In fact, we got to the point where a ritual at Thanksgiving was to go out in the backyard and fire off everybody's rockets. But you learn a tremendous amount of physics just from getting these things to go, from making pumpkin catapults and potato cannons. And it's very appealing, is all I can say. Okay, anybody into dangerous science? Just a little bit?
I might not look like it, but I really do like danger.
I don't either, but yeah, it's good. There's nothing like the thrill of seeing a potato go a mile and not knowing where it fell. Do any of you use these Tops books? Look, if you look it up online, look up Tops Science. If you just look up Tops, I think you get a bunch of bikinis. These are really clever. They're these little black and white notebooks They're very hands-on. It's lots and lots of experiments, but it's all done with stuff you've got around the house, like cans and paper clips and drinking straws. But they do really clever things with it, more so than there are a lot of these books that say this is an experiment with just ordinary stuff you'd have around the house. Well, maybe, because sometimes it turns out ordinary stuff you'd have around the house, you need a black light. Or it's kind of boring and it just uses soap. But with these, I remember the first one we built, you build a little, like a little balance for weighing things. And it just took like you made little cups by wrapping foil around batteries, and then you balanced it over a clothespin in a tin can, little graph on top of it. It was really clever. So take a look at these. There's a whole slew of them, and for various ages from maybe 2nd or 3rd grade all the way up. And they also have step-by-step instructions for the instructor. So if you need help, they follow you right along. Anybody doing chemistry? I know I'm always shoving chemistry down everybody's throats. Vicky Cobb's Chemically Active is one of the best books I've ever seen for like middle school kids or beginners doing chemistry. She has real chemistry experiments and she explains them very well. And it's substantive. Vicky Cobb is a good source. Anybody got high school? Teenagers?
Yeah,
Okay.
middle school and next year high school.
Yeah, good textbook. There's a couple of ways that people advise teaching science. This guy has an integrated approach in which the major sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, and earth and space science, are all pulled together. So you use aspects of all of them for any given science topic. I really liked it. I thought it was a much more effective way to teach science than the other way is individual packets. So you get biology, and then you're taught chemistry, and then physics, and then earth science. Usually earth science is first, but they're very individual. Whereas if you integrate it, it's much more effective, it's much more memorable. I wrote a book on memory some years back, in which you have no idea how nervous you get writing a book about memory. All of a sudden, you seem completely empty-headed. It's like, I've lost my glasses again. Is this the beginning of the end? But one thing that all the memory research emphasizes is the more connections you've got, the better. And this is much, much better for not only for memory, but for general education. So integrate. What was the saying? The saying is like memory is like a tree growing hooks. So the more that you can load on that, the more likely your kids are to recognize something. They'll have like a pool of interconnected knowledge rather than all these individual facts that don't necessarily fit together. I mean,
That's why I constantly ask, like, why am I even learning this? It doesn't make any sense, like for math or something, and it's not used in something, just, the sheets or whatever, and I was like, I don't want to learn this, it's, so boring, I don't know what I'm using it for. It's like the constant thing.
we've all got them. My oldest was very much of a literature man from day one, and very much not a math person. And we'll get to math right there. It did not like math, and I realized after the fact, after trying every permutation of arithmetic that I could possibly think of, that he didn't like arithmetic. He didn't mind math. Math was kind of interesting. And there's this book, The Mathematician's Lament, by Paul Lockhart, is written by a mathematician, and it's a skinny little book, and it's really worth a look, because this is all on his objection to the way math is taught in schools. And what is taught in schools is arithmetic. He says what kids need is puzzles. What they need chess. They need, how would you tile a floor if you've got hexagonal tiles and you need to do something in the corners? They need things to figure out rather than these endless worksheets of multiplication problems. So he's an interesting read in the way he would approach teaching math. And the closest thing I've ever found to a textbook that follows his advice is Harold Jacobs' Mathematics: A Human Endeavor, which we started using, I think, when our kids were probably, 12-ish. And it's all puzzles and interconnections. It's a fascinating book. And it starts out with billiard table problems. If you've got a billiard table of such and such a size, and you hit a ball, what's the path that it takes, and how will it bounce? And what if you make it a long, skinny table, or a short, fat table? And I remember our middle kid, who's really into math, said, what if it's a round table? And how would you tell? And we ended up we had this big round thing that we used for making giant bubbles. Have you seen those big pans? Well, we coated it with flour, and we got a ball, and we rolled the ball through this big pan. But this whole book is like that. It's endless kinds of historical puzzles. There's a whole thing on codes and ciphers. It's really a fascinating book. It's way more interesting than Saxon math. Anybody got any math stories? Yeah. I don't know. I had kids. We had one kid, and I sort of assumed the next kid would be like the first kid, and the third kid would be, they'd all be kind of alike. And of course not. No. And so Josh, who was a very advanced reader and was into literature, philosophy, he liked logic puzzles, he liked history.
Yeah, that's my oldest.
And he said, by hook and by crook, I got him through algebra, beginning algebra, at which point he folded his arms and said, if I need this in my future life, I will learn it then. But I am done. And by this stage, Randy and I had been yapping along for years about how we are homeschooling, so we will raise independent thinkers with opinions of their own that they can express well. Well, he had opinions of his own, and he expressed it well, and we were stuck. So it's, okay, Josh, but, and I'm going, SATs. He stopped. Then we had Ethan, who was very inventive in math. I mean, I remember him as just a little tyke, figuring out how to draw things in 3D. And it was really exciting. I mean, I was puttering around in the kitchen, and all of a sudden Ethan yells, Mom! And I'm thinking, blood! So I came running, and he figured out how to make a cylinder in 3D, and then he figured out how to make a cube, and then he just went wild on this. He liked geometry. But Ethan is a touch dyslexic. It took him quite a while to learn to read. And his thought was, well, I'm I'm going to be a computer scientist, and I really don't see any need whatsoever for me ever reading Shakespeare, or he had a long list of things that really didn't fit into his life work. He came around a bit eventually. He went to school for computer science, went to college for computer science. But they all were required to take a course that I think it was called Big Questions, where they had to read and discuss a number of books. And he said from his homeschool background, he was really good at that. He really liked that. So, but from homeschooling, I kind of came out with the idea that we can kind of aim at reasonably well-rounded, but none of us really are well-rounded. You all fall into your preferred track eventually. Oh, and have any of you seen this? One of the problems that I know I had with homeschool, I don't love math. I was reasonably good at it. With the biochemistry, I went through calculus 2. I loathe calculus. When your kids are excited about something that you're interested in, it's much easier for you to respond to it than when they're excited about something that you can't do very well. And I know for our 2 younger kids, both of them were real builders. They would have loved to have made ham radios or learned how to solder. And their dad was working full time, so they only had him to do this stuff with on weekends. So I don't think it hurt them. They became very resourceful, understanding that mom really can't put the Legos together. But it worried me.
Just sort of in line with that is that my older daughter is not a typically math brain human and doesn't love math, and I'm like mediocre at best and made my way through school fine in math, but I'm not math or science minded, and neither is she. And I find myself, she's in 7th grade, and I find myself like one step ahead of her, like relearning how to do anything that we're working on. And what she really appreciates about that, this is kind of great, is she's like, so you're gonna learn the math and then we're gonna like learn it together, like we kind of do it together as this thing. And she's made comments several times, and I realized the truth in this is that like, I don't use this stuff every day all the time, and I am still a very competent human being and get through my life just fine, but I'm able to look at it and learn it with you, maybe one step ahead of you, so I can kind of explain the concept, and then we do it together, and we laugh about it when it's stupid. And that, I think, brings like this whole like reality into it, like, okay, so I'm not necessarily she knows I'm not gonna be a mathematician in my job, but I'll point out, this is stuff you're gonna use all the time. Like, this is just everyday useful stuff. So like, let's really focus and figure out how to do it. This word problem is ridiculous, and no one is ever gonna need to know this.
Yeah, when did you last do a polynomial equation?
So, and then my younger daughter is like, math comes so easy to her, and it's super different between the two of them. And so I'm like, oh, you really, like, you enjoy this in a way that you do not.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
How one of them will look at an equation and say, that's cool.
Yeah.
How did you do that? I want to do those.
Yeah.
There's an article, it's a Nicholson-Baker article again, that he got a lot of attention for. I think it was published, I just looked at this, in Harper's. It's called Wrong Answer, and it's a whole essay on we should do away with Algebra 2, which ordinarily I think you take when you're like a junior in high school. Well, it turns out that Algebra 2, he's arguing against higher math for most people. And his argument was that for most jobs, you really don't need calculus, you don't need Algebra 2. and it makes people miserable, and it makes people drop out of school. Literally, people don't pass Algebra 2, and there's a percentage that either quit or drop out of school in despair. So he made a long argument against higher math, to which the mathematicians all responded, well, the skills that you learn in higher math are reasoning skills. It's not necessarily the math, it's the ability to solve a problem and to attack, a wide range of problems. So there's two different thoughts there. All I can tell you is Josh, with a little bit of algebra, has gotten through life very easily. He took logic in college. He was a philosophy major as an undergraduate and liked logic. But to this day, I'm not really convinced he can do the multiplication table.
And can I just say one more thing that I meant to say at the beginning of that, or at the end of what I was saying, is that my daughter, who is not the math brained one, or the arithmetic brained one, is an incredible chess player and focuses all on music, which are both
Totally math.
Right, which is just really funny, and that's what drives her. So I try to tell her, like, math is what drives you, and she's like, oh, yeah.
See, but that's the mathematician's lament. He
Right,
would
and then
love
I saw that
that.
book, and I was like, oh, I should get that.
Yes, it's skinny. It's not a tiny book.
That sounds good.
This is for history. This was a course that was taught at Bennington College. It may be still taught at Bennington by a history professor named Eileen Scully. The journey each semester literally was composed of a journey at a different time from two different places. Like, for example, you would go from London to Beijing in the year 1300. This is a whole semester course. It was like a historical role-playing game. First, you had to decide who you were, what your profession was, what your family was, where you lived, how wealthy you were. Then you had to figure out how you were going to get from London to Cathay at the time. How would you travel? How would you finance your journey? Where would you go? Trails. What would you meet along the way? And you had to document the whole thing by keeping a journal and by writing letters home. And I was fascinated with this. And so we tried this when I think Caleb, my youngest, was in high school. And we had set ours in, I stayed home. I was in Victorian England, was very interested in science, had two little girls and wanted to have a microscope. And Caleb was my nephew who was traveling from London to Japan and then writing letters home along the way. And we had our characters. But the amount of research that went into writing those letters was incredible. I was blown away by this, and it's a lot of fun. You're inventing a pen pal scenario, basically. But you can't write a letter without looking up, what would you eat? What would you wear? Did little girls go swimming in the Victorian era? What kind of books did you read? Did you have magazines? How did you feel about women's suffrage? And of course, Caleb's, from all his points along the way, was, what were you seeing? What would you eat? Were you being attacked by bandits? How safe were you? I love the journey. It's a fun try if you've got any interest in that kind of history. What else do we use? I really like Joy Hakim's books. History is story, I think, is the really important thing. I know personally, I probably remember a lot more history from reading fiction, historical fiction, than I do from any textbook I ever had in school.
That's how we approach history.
Is there a dragon? I see ships.
Show me your
Where's the dragon?
This is a dragon? Asia?
It does kind of with the little dots. Look, see, there's an eye.
Guess you see more than me.
Good for you.
Lucky you say.
Nice dragon.
But I remember tons of Egyptian history from reading Mara, Daughter of the Nile in 5th grade. Reading. Nobody really knows how kids learn how to read. There wouldn't be so much research on it if it were easy peasy. There's a guy named Peter Gray who's written a number of books on this. He wrote one called Free to Learn, which was basically like more independent play. And his take on reading was kids are going to learn to read sometime, usually between the ages of 5 and 11. If they're just left on their own, exposed to books, you read to them, sooner or later they'll pick it up. Being able to sit back and say, okay with this is almost impossible. For one thing, especially if you're trying to keep up with the public school, which in theory you should be doing in Vermont, if they're really not reading by the time they're 6, they're at a real disadvantage. Our oldest and youngest kids read very young, and I'm convinced that they taught themselves to read through reading Calvin and Hobbes. I mean, we read constantly. We had tons of books around the house. We did a lot of reading-oriented things. But basically, they would sit there with Garfield or Calvin and Hobbes, and they read. Ethan, the math kid, who's left-handed, didn't read. And so I read Peter Gray, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to be calm. And then, of course, I panicked. And we got Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. And Ethan liked it. It uses a phonetic alphabet. So it's very easy to translate word sounds into words using this phonetic alphabet. You know, the upside down E and whatnot. But the point of the book is that it's transitioning you into the non-phonetic alphabet. So all of a sudden you've got words like neighbor. And Ethan was completely disgusted. You know, it makes sense here, this is ridiculous. And I remember at the time we did a whole bunch of stuff on proposals for simplified alphabets. Ben Franklin had a proposal for eliminating, I think, 4 different letters of the alphabet that he said you could perfectly, you know, you don't need C. You've got S and K, so you don't need C. So I think George Bernard Shaw did one too that was simplified spelling. And Ethan said, yeah. Oh, and then Ethan in spelling, we've got spell check. So why will I ever need to spell? And I'm like, as a writer, Ethan, I can tell you that spell check can take you down a garden path faster. That it will correct something and you will find that you've got something there that you really don't want. You know, spell check doesn't always know what you were meaning to say.
That's right.
But historically, homeschoolers are supposed to be genius spellers. We win all the spelling bees, right?
Got enough time to practice.
I guess so. But spelling is kind of fascinating because spelling seems to be, I'm an excellent speller. Two of my kids are good spellers. One of my kids is a terrible speller. But in science, I've worked with a number of people who can't spell their way out of a cardboard box. So clearly there's something brain centered that goes on there. I mean, you know I visualize words. You know, sometimes if I'm unsure if I write it down, I know how it's spelled instantly. So I don't know what happens when you're a poor speller, or if it makes a difference. Ethan seems to be going through life quite nicely on his computer. But,
It seems to me like reading equals spelling. In a
and
way.
grammar.
I just don't put a lot of focus on spelling, and didn't with Piper. She was the one who just came up. Her spelling was, she was just a phonetic speller for the longest time.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to Josh one day, and I was like, I don't know if I'm doing the wrong thing, or like I don't really correct. We corrected a little bit, and he was like, she reads, Meg, it's gonna come. And it's amazing, it's just coming.
It does.
I don't drill her on her spelling, but like, she's a pretty good speller now, because she reads and reads and reads and reads.
And I think, and that's grammar too. They actually,
And grammar too, yeah.
they actually did a study that showed, they had three different English classes, I think. One of them, they taught grammar as a separate subject, where you learned the definition of gerund, and you diagrammed sentences. You learned what a pluperfect verb was, the whole grammar. And the alternative one is they taught no grammar, and they simply let the kids read and write. And the class that just read and wrote did much, much better than the class that had grammar as a separate subject, and they all hated the grammar.
Mhm.
And because there are wonderful reference books if you ever need to look anything up that you can.
Grammar is just important, I think, that you learn another language.
It does help with that.
Yeah, and mine, one of mine took Latin and said that he found Latin grammar much more, very logical. That was Josh, the oldest one. And
Yeah, I think Latin grammar is probably pretty logical. They have very strict rules, and there's not so much
yeah, and
wiggle room.
it's
There's a lot of wiggle room in English, it's just like a lot of exceptions.
well, English is a really versatile, but a really difficult language. Because it's all over the place.
Yeah, with the non-phonetic spelling, and there's some parts that are super easy. Like the grammar part is technically kind of easy, but there's a lot of exemptions.
There's a lot of
So that
exceptions
makes
to
it hard
everything.
again. But yeah,
Yeah.
as an issue, like every language.
Oh, we came to foreign languages and Ethan wanted to learn Sumerian. Okay.
Did you succeed?
We got a book on it, and we watched a whole bunch of stuff with Irving Finkel. Irving Finkel is the curator, the Middle Eastern curator at the British Museum, and he's got these wonderful YouTube things now. Not when Ethan wanted to learn Sumerian, he just had a book. So you can go online and learn how to write cuneiform. Irving Finkel is my hero. If I had school to do over again, I would go directly to the British Museum and work with Irving Finkel. What else? College? Want to hear about? Want to hear anything more subversive from me?
I'm curious, you had mentioned that word SAT, well, not a word, but earlier, and like as you're one of the things that you would sort of panic over. So did your kids take the SATs?
Not all of them. Josh, as you could imagine, said he didn't need any SAT to tell anybody how educated he was. He rolled into college. He did, apparently he can talk the hind leg off a mule. He did wonderful college interviews. He wrote his essays, which were fine. He had one college, I think that anything you want to ask us, Mom. And he had one college that wanted him to take the GED, and he said no, and had a number of reasons for not taking the GED. It's a difficult child. But very, very charming. But he went to Bennington College as an undergraduate and then went to the New School in New York for his master's. And
otherwise, no one requires SAT or?
Nobody
curious.
ever mentioned the lack of algebra.
Or the lack of that.
So he skated through. As I said, I don't know what I'd recommend for people. The two younger ones both took the SAT. And they did well. But our only previous experience with standardized tests in Colorado, we homeschooled for a year and a half in Colorado. Well, Randy was working for a company named Somatogen that went out of business. They were doing blood substitutes. We've always had a lot of cool info on biotech. But I think Josh was in 3rd grade, and they required the CAT tests in 3rd grade. So he had to take standardized tests. They let him take it at home because I qualified as a test giver because I'd had that course in biostatistics. And it was a difficult experience. He hadn't had a test before, and he argued every step of the way. I remember they had a long section where you were supposed to tell the difference between, is this fiction or nonfiction? And one of the questions was, and I will never forget this, is, can cats talk? Well, obviously they wanted you to say a talking cat would be fiction. And Josh said, well, they meow. Animals communicate by meowing. You know, they'll meow when they want to be fed. That's like saying, I want food. I think it's nonfiction. Wow. Josh, we can't talk about this now. You're taking the test. It's a time test. You've got 15 minutes to finish this. Fill in the bubbles, and we'll talk about the cats later. I mean, we must have spent a week doing this whole series of standardized tests, and I hated them. And they're clearly very. I can see why you teach to the test, because one whole chunk of this test was on the how to write a friendly letter. Well, my kids wrote letters. They had pen pals. They wrote letters. But we never did anything on how to formally write a friendly letter. Of course, Josh's argument was this is a friendly letter. So why would we be doing anything formal with the friendly letter? But they were very specific things. As I said, Josh did very well, but I mean, he had to learn phonics like on the fly while taking this test because he clearly had to read as a sight reader. So we never went through this whole thing, hard G, soft G. No, we did. A little bit. We read Dr. Seuss's alphabet book. Big A, little a, what's begin with A? Aunt Annie's alligator. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but it's almost noon, and I know you have this other talk, and we have the potluck, so I just want to make sure that, you know, everyone's like needs will be met with whatever questions they might have come to you with,
gosh,
because you
I'm
have
so
so
sorry.
many resources and experience, and like I
I
could just
never
sit and
shut
listen forever. No, this is great. I'm thoroughly enjoying this.
Me too.
It was fun. Of my now well grown up children, two of them wholeheartedly adored their homeschooling experience. Ethan says if he and his fiance have children, he wants to homeschool them. She's a little shaky. Caleb, our youngest, very much liked homeschooling, but he was a drama kid. He liked the theater. We had him involved in all kinds of stuff. So he did quite a bit at the public high school. He took drama, he took the literature of drama, he acted in all of our high school plays. And he was by far the most interested, probably the most social of our three. So he enjoyed having more company.
And he's a librarian now, right?
He's now in New York City. He's working for the Mount Sinai Library. But he was a library. He'd like to get back to Vermont. He really liked being a library director in Vermont. He's got a baby now. So, hey.
Do you have any questions before, like, it seems like maybe
But before I go.
working down the
I'm
stairs?
trying to think if I have any burning questions.
Ooh, email me. We can talk. I may not have any answers.
That would be great.
As I said, absolutely everybody does it differently, has different experiences, finds out that different things work for their kids, different things work for different kids. The Cuisinart rods that you spend a fortune buying, all they want to do is build towers with them. They really don't want to do the little math exercises, or some of them do want to do the little math exercises. So, you know, so much of it is I found was flying by the seat of my pants. I think what happens in homeschooling is you just get comfortable flying by the seat of your pants. It's like, this is the way it is. So we'll see.
Yeah, the nagging question would be, am I doing enough?
Yeah,
Do you find, we did this in like a series of sine waves. I would think, we're not doing enough. They're not getting any enrichment, they're not getting any socialization. So we would become involved in way too many things. And the kids would say, all we're doing is running around, and you know, why can't we just stay home and read in front of the wood stove? So then, and then I think, we're not doing anything. You know? So, you know, it went like.
Roller coaster.
It's great to hear you have your kids that are on the other end of it, and
Yeah.
they're competent, and
They still love us.
they're involved in the world, I'm sure, in very meaningful ways. And that's what I try to remind myself.
And they're very opinionated. And they're polite.
Success.
Success.
I sort of have a question on that end, like, in terms of like looking ahead into like teenage years, like people, I'm sure you all know, you get a lot of feedback, like, how are you gonna teach them when they're 14? You don't know how to do whatever math, or you don't know how, well, first of all, like, I already realized that that's BS, but in terms of like the relationship between me and like you and your kids, like it changes when they're teenagers and they do need more things, and like how does that sort of, did it just sort of evolve and like became fine?
I don't remember having problems with a couple of things. Foreign languages, I was weak on. I could read French, but nobody wants to hear my accent. And it should not be passed on to the next generation. So, you know, we found various kinds of online programs,
Yeah,
extracurricular stuff. When Ethan got into higher math, you know, he went into calculus. He took college courses. You know, you can find online courses. You know what's great is Khan Academy.
Yeah, we use that.
Yeah, I mean that's
And my
we
kids
didn't
really
have that
teach
available.
themselves.
But
Like my 14-year-old, she reads it herself, figures it out. I'm trying to read a little bit along, but I'm like out of the picture basically.
Yeah.
But, you know,
I guess I meant more, I didn't say that very well, like in terms of like they're needing more friends, or like needing to be more outside of the house. Does that seem like when they're teenagers that's sort of was a struggle, or was it?
all of mine said that they felt that they were socialized, but they weren't socialized like kids are usually socialized.
Mhm.
So when they went into college, you know, they had a lot of interaction with mixed age groups, probably a lot more interaction with adults. And both my two oldest said that when they went into college and it was a whole bunch of kids their own age, that was an adjustment.
Yeah.
They weren't used to that. Caleb was fine. But that was the one thing they said. They said they didn't feel they weren't socialized, but they clearly felt they were differently socialized. And we kind of said, we think that's good. You know, the kind of socialization you see on the average school playground isn't exactly what,
Is that the model?
Okay, I hear you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's like socialization is an interesting topic that comes up a lot, I think, with outside families to homeschooling families. And my kids are both really social. They love hanging out with other kids, schooled and non. And one of the biggest feedback that I hear, Piper does chorus and piano at the school in Hardwick, is that she's fascinated by the fact that because she hasn't been part of that institution her whole life, she almost doesn't exist to them because there's this real tight social structure and hierarchy that's already built, and it's taken an entire year to make friends that she didn't know before she went into that, and that people that she knows from homeschooling and outside of school kind of look through her at school and don't say hi to her in school, but if they see her someplace else they might say hi. So socialization is a funny thing, because I think socialization that happens in school is somewhat restrictive.
Sometimes it's downright mean.
And mean, yeah. And I'm like, just say hello. That's what you do best. Just say hi to someone. If they look at you and you clearly know who they are, just acknowledge them and say hi. She's like, yeah, they just look through me like they don't even know me and they never met me and I've known them my whole life. It's just funny. It's funny.
I know when, Josh and Ethan did not have any high school experiences, but of course Caleb did. And Caleb was pretty boggled. He said, wow, he thought it was rude. Teachers yelled, kids yelled. He was kind of blown away at first, though he really enjoyed being part of the theater group. And you know how in schools, kids group, there were the theater kids and the art kids, and they were, all of ours were really into music. They belonged to the Green Mountain Orchestra for years, went to music camp, were part of community theater. So you meet a lot of people through there with similar interests. But, we're kind of introverted too. I don't know. We did did you ever fool around with the Myers-Briggs test? Yeah. So, which defines your personality type. Right.
Yeah.
And, Ethan and I both turned out so introverted that it's amazing we ever get out from underneath a table. And I took it a number of times trying to, at least move myself up a little. But they're good. I mean,
It's funny.
yeah, I was really judgmental too.
I don't want to hold everybody up, but I have a question about recognizing learning difficulties within your kids in the early sort of elementary or mid-elementary. We're moving to Vermont from Massachusetts, so it's not a big change in the regulations and restrictions. But I know in Vermont, it seems like they need to have some sort of evaluation from an education professional. That's something.
Or your
that we do.
pediatrician, I think, could do that too.
Oh, the pediatrician can do it.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I thought it had to be a teacher or yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you had one in Massachusetts, then.
We never had to do an evaluation to homeschool in Massachusetts. We just had to deal with the local school authorities.
Right.
That's the difference down there. Is our district was okay with it, and and that's all we have to do. But we do think that, one of our children, has reading difficulties that look
Yeah.
like dysgraphia or possibly dyslexia. So we don't know if that's something in Vermont that gets picked up by this 4B sort of process, or,
Your pediatrician will ask you,
yeah,
and whatever you tell them.
they'll go with. Alright.
Yeah.
Great. So she doesn't have dysgraphia. No,
I
so
mean, I guess-
I
Yeah, I
really
mean, we
wanna
weren't, we
know.
weren't sure about our Ethan, our middle kid either,
Yeah.
because he wrote everything backwards for ages
Uh-huh.
and clearly had trouble reading.
Yeah.
He's not, he's got a touch of
Mhm.
dyslexia, but, just enough that it slows him down.
Well, what would the prescription be then?
Well, basically,
One-on-one,
yeah, like
with what
a
you're
different,
Yeah.
a different teaching approach, basically, something to adapt to that.
Yeah,
Yeah, which is also sometimes nice to,
Yeah.
take the resource if you
Yeah.
offer
Yeah.
into that category.
Yeah.
Then you
And
have, Vermont offers a lot of, which I like about Vermont, they offer a lot of
Yeah.
different things
Okay,
from school that you can
Mhm.
choose and do on your own,
okay,
on your own time basically, but it's paid for and available
Cool.
basically,
Yeah.
which is nice.
My husband is a special educator and
Uh-huh.
he has homeschoolers on his caseload.
okay,
Like you could
Okay.
go, if you're in Greensboro, you could go to Lakeview and say, I want my homeschool child to be evaluated for
Great.
this thing. And
Through
then they'll set you up
this
with
evening
support.
district, okay,
Yeah,
okay,
just whoever, yeah, whatever.
cool, that's good to know.
So they don't tell you you can't homeschool.
No,
No,
like
they
that
don't.
service
No.
is available to you
Okay.
as a taxpayer in the town.
they just wanna
Well,
make
that's
sure
really
that
good
you're dealing with it if it is a
Yeah, that's all we
problem.
wanna do. We were a little bit worried about all of a sudden getting like hooked back into public school because,
No, you
they
won't
would
get,
think that.
that won't happen,
handle
you can
that.
still choose.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can, as the parent, you can say yes or no to whatever service
Cool,
they.
good to know.
Yeah, and you do,
That's great.
you're also able to take advantage now of a lot of things that if you want them, that the school has.
Okay.
Yeah.
Your kid can go in and take classes
My
at the
kids
school.
take like math in school
Really?
and the other one English and and PE or
Oh, cool.
art. They do different things there, but they're not, it has to be less than 50% in school.
Oh, that's, I had no
Yeah,
idea.
the one thing that they get
That's
sticky about is
okay.
high school sports.
Yeah. What's that?
They're high school sports. They're
Yeah.
perfectly happy for you to take French or chemistry, but if you want to be on the soccer team, there's a little scratchiness.
Around here, it's
Not
very
here.
easy.
Boy, we had,
Yeah.
They're
yeah.
dying for.
They
And
won't
then
have
when you
to
see anybody-
That's really nice because I've got friends who said they've had real trouble
I
with
think it's district
sports.
dependent in Vermont.
Yeah.
Like it really matters like what school district and who the administration is that you're working with.
So maybe it was
Yeah.
the Bennington School District,
It really
but they were just so upset that homeschoolers might take.
It's
If you're
fine.
not gonna pay your dues by going to the school, you shouldn't be on the soccer team.
Wow. That says a lot about the public education. It's basically like if you don't pay your dues by coming to work,
You
you
kind of pay your dues anyway.
Pay your dues, you're not suffering enough.
pay taxes.
Well, we actually, decided where we were going to live when we were in Massachusetts,
Uh-huh.
based on
Oh, that's
talking to
okay.
the school superintendent.
Okay,
Because we hit one that was absolutely anti.
yeah.
And then we hit one that was just a sweetheart, so,
It's a different fiefdom every town, so, but that's good to know about the à la carte sort of, you can take a couple classes in school. That
Yeah.
might help with my son's like social needs. He's 13, he's about had it.
Yeah, that's what mine was. And then she went to Hazen for a year, now she had it with Hazen.
There you
so.
go, right. So he's on the Hazen basketball team, so he's getting in there, and now that he sees what the basketball boys are all up to at school, he wants some of that fun, because that's what he wants to go to school for, is just fun.
Just the fun.
Yeah.
That's exactly what mine wanted to.
Okay.
So I just go in and
That's
see
why Piper
what
goes.
classes are pretty
Oh, God,
crazy.
so
She's
read
like, "Still, I'm
substitute."
wasting my time."
Totally, that could give him a
But, you know,
taste,
it's a
and
cool
not have to
taste.
go all the way in.
Exactly. You
That's
can just
really
relax
good.
and
Yeah.
take a little class here. and maybe
2/3
like
at
it.
home, right?
Yeah,
60%.
Awesome, thank you. That's really
Yeah.
Which works out to be
And
like
it's-
two classes.
we couldn't do that.
Two courses
Yeah.
in school.
That came
Yeah.
in
4 classes in school.
just too late
Yeah,
for
we can
us.
switch it up, cause like Phoebe goes just 2 days per week.
Right, two
Okay.
days.
She doesn't go 3 days, like
Right,
3 days,
right.
so she's not doing like math every single day at
Okay,
school. Does
okay.
that make sense?
Yeah.
There's different, like, a lot of.
So you
Yeah,
do like
elementary
smart or by
school, you
Sunday?
can choose the days,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, the other thing too, though, that was really, that we couldn't take advantage of, when we were down south, in the Bennington School District, you could take classes as a high school student at Bennington College or Williams College.
Oh.
and for free.
Awesome.
And that was, yeah,
For high schoolers,
2 years at
I think-
ATC, right?
yeah, or, I always still call it Johnson, but whatever it is now, they do that,
For the early college, is that what you
yeah,
yeah.
I think that's only in your senior year though, right?
I think so.
But your second, you can take another year for free now, as of this year. There's another, like, so you can take your senior year at college, or after college, or like early college, and then you can get, so you can end up with an associate's degree for free. I think there might be an income, like a parent income level too, or not for that,
I think there is.
but
Yeah, we'll see what happens with,
it's a lot of credit.
I was just so relieved when they backed off on not eliminating all the college libraries.
Yeah.
Are you insane?
That was crazy.
We will save money by eliminating,
No, he's fired, there's a new person.
Oh, good. That was a good one.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
This has been
Thank
so
you.
delightful to talk about homeschooling with you.
don't feel that I'm very helpful, but I lived.
Yeah.
And we can continue the conversation out back.
Yeah.
While the kids run around and
Right,
food.
right. During eating hot dogs.
Yeah, so I can stop.